The bell at the side door rang twice, then a third time, impatient, and Orwen counted the seconds before she answered, because counting was the only thing that kept her hands from shaking. 1, 2, 3. She set the inkpot back on the blotter with a small, deliberate click. 4. She closed the ledger. 5. She rose. By 6, she was in the corridor, by 7 at the door, and by 8, she had opened it on a woman she had never met but had imagined in detail for 91 nights. The woman on the step was wrapped in a traveling cloak the color of bruised plums, with rain caught in the fur at her throat. She was beautiful in the way that a struck bell is beautiful, she said. Without preamble, I have come for what is mine. Iorwen tilted her head, as she might have tilted it at a piece of correspondence whose hand she did not recognize, and answered, "Then please come in out of the wet." The woman blinked. It was the smallest blink in the world. It was, however, a blink. Iorwen stepped aside, and the visitor stepped through, and the door shut on the courtyard with that particular sound that good carpentry makes when it has been kept oiled, a sound like a sentence ending. The hall was lamplit and warm and absolutely silent. Somewhere upstairs a clock counted on without them. Somewhere further in, a kettle that did not yet know it was needed sat cold on a hook. The visitor turned a slow circle on the stone, taking inventory. The long table polished by 3 generations of women, the painting of the river at low tide, the row of pegs from which a man's riding gloves had been removed only an hour ago. Her gaze paused at the glove's absence, then returned to Iorwen, and in that pause she made the first mistake of her evening, although she did not know it. She had expected to be argued with. She had expected the trembling lip, the high color in the cheek, the famous cold rage of a wife who has been told too late and in the wrong room. She had braced for a scene. Iorwen, instead, said, "Will you take tea, or do you prefer to begin at once?" The woman's name, which she now offered as one offers a passport at a border, was Selvin Marith. Iorwen had known this for some weeks. Iorwen had known a great many things for some weeks. She inclined her head as if hearing the name for the first time, and she said, "Selvin, then, come through." She did not say, "My lady." She did not say, "Madam." She did not say it with weight, either, the way some women press a name like a thumb against a bruise. She said it the way one says the name of a horse one has been told is difficult. Selvin followed her into the small east parlor because there was nothing else to do, and because already, in 11 seconds at the door, she had lost the shape of the conversation she had rehearsed. She had rehearsed it on the road from the coast. She had rehearsed it through 2 changes of carriage and a wet inn. She had rehearsed it, in particular, in the long, dull stretch between the abbey and the bridge, where the country flattens and there is no scenery to interrupt the building of a grievance. She had assembled, over those hours, a speech of precise cruelty, the kind that begins, "He does not love you," and ends with a list of dates. She had been looking forward to delivering it. The trouble was that there was no one yet to deliver it to. Iorwen had not, somehow, taken her place at the other end of the rehearsal. Iorwen had instead opened the door. The east parlor was the small one, the one with the green wallpaper that had not been fashionable for 30 years and was therefore, by the household's quiet logic, beyond fashion altogether. There was a fire in it. There were 2 chairs near the fire. There was a low table with a tray that had not been set out for the visitor, but had been set out for Iorwen herself, with a single cup, a small pot, and a plate of plain biscuits of the kind one eats while reading. Iorwen did not ring for another cup. She lifted her own from the tray, set it on the mantel out of the way, and gestured Selvin to a chair. Selvin did not sit. She remained standing in the center of the rug, in her bruised plum cloak with rain still beating at the collar, and she said, "You know why I am here." Orwen folded her hands in front of her. "I expect I do," she said. "I expect you have come a long way to say it. Would you like to say it sitting down, or do you require to be on your feet?" Selvin sat. She had not meant to. She sat the way people sit when the room itself has decided for them. The chair was low and deep, which is the kind of chair that flatters tall women in repose and disadvantages tall women in argument. Eorwen, who was not tall, remained standing for one further beat, just long enough for the geometry to register, and then she sat too, opposite, and arranged her skirts with the same care she gave to closing a ledger. There was a clock on the mantel. It said 8:15. The room said nothing else. Selvin, who had built her arrival around the assumption of fury, now had to choose between waiting for fury or producing her speech without it. She chose the speech. She had paid in advance for the speech with all those miles. "He has been mine," she said, "since before the wedding. He came to me on the third night after. He has come to me every season since. He has written me letters in his own hand, which I have kept, and I can list them by date. He keeps a ring of mine in the drawer of the bureau in his dressing room, in a small box under his cravats. He calls me by a name he does not use with anyone else. I did not come here to humiliate you. I came because I am tired of being kept like an animal in a stable he visits. I came because I am done with arrangements. I want a settlement. I want it from him. But I will hear from you first whether you intend to fight, because I would rather know before I unpack my trunk at the inn." There, it was out. It had taken her perhaps 90 seconds. She had practiced it down to 83, but the cloak had cost her time. She sat back, breathing carefully, and waited. Eorwen did not breathe carefully. Eorwen breathed the way she always breathed, evenly, with the small habitual pause at the top of each inhalation that her old governess had once mistaken for piety, and that was in fact only her listening for the next thing in the house. She listened now. She listened past Selvin, past the fire, past the clock, into the hush of the corridor where she had taught herself, year after year, to hear the particular footfalls of every person under this roof. She heard the cook on the kitchen stair, 2 floors down. She heard the rain at the western windows, where it would be coming in under the casement that she had been told for 3 years would be repaired in the spring. She heard the wind in the elms at the far end of the drive. She did not, importantly, hear her husband. He was not in the house. He had ridden out at 6. He had ridden out, she knew, because she had read the letter he did not know she had read, to meet a man at a tavern 11 miles off, on a matter he believed was private. He would not be home until past midnight. Whatever happened in this room would happen without him, and would, when he learned of it, have already happened. This was the first of several advantages Eorwen had taken some weeks to assemble, and she felt it settle into place now with the small interior click of a key turning. She looked at Selvin, who was waiting with her chin slightly raised, ready to be despised. Eorwen did not despise her. She found, on first inspection, that she had no feeling for her at all of the shape one might have predicted. There was no hot wave. There was no cold one either. There was a clean, sober interest, of the kind she felt when a new tenant came to negotiate a lease, and she had to decide within the first 10 minutes whether he was honest, capable, or merely loud. Selvin, she decided, was not loud. Selvin was tired. Selvin had been tired for a long time. She set this aside, because it was not yet useful. She said, "You have come a long way to give me information I already possess." Selvin's chin moved a fraction. You knew. I have known for 91 days, said Yoren, who counted things. The first letter was in March. The ring was bought in Aldermere on the 17th of April. I have the receipt, because the man you both used to write to is a cousin of mine, although neither of you, I imagine, ever asked his surname. He is a cousin, and he is loyal, and he is fond of me. I have the dates. I have the names. I have, in fact, a list rather longer than yours, because I have had longer to make it. Selvin's mouth opened, then did not produce a sound. She had built her speech on the assumption of being the bringer of news. She had not budgeted for being the recipient of any. Yorwen continued, in the same even tone, the tone in which she might have read out an inventory of linens. I tell you this not to wound you and not to compete with you. I tell you so that we may stop pretending, both of us, that this conversation is the conversation we expected. It is not. You came to confront a woman who did not know. That woman is not in the room. There is only me. The fire crackled. Selvin, who had a great many qualities and a not inconsiderable mind, did the thing that genuinely intelligent people do when their plan is shattered. She stopped speaking and waited to see what the new conversation would be. Yorwen poured tea. There was, after all, only the one cup, and so she poured into it and handed it to Selvin and went to the bell pull and rang once for another. Then she sat again and folded her hands again and said, "Tell me about the settlement." Selvin, who had not expected to be invited to the table she had come to overturn, began, with the cup warming her palms, to speak more slowly than she had on the road. She spoke of the years. She spoke of the letters, of which there were 41. She spoke of the name he called her, which Yorwen had already guessed, and which she did not flinch to hear aloud. She spoke of the small house on the coast that he had promised and not provided, of the boy she had born in the second year and lost in the third, and never told him about, because she had not wanted the visit that would follow. She spoke of the way one becomes accustomed to a hidden life, until the hiddenness itself becomes a wall against which one's actual life thins to paper. Yorwen listened. She did not interrupt. She did not arrange her face. She let the woman speak. When the maid came in with the second cup, Yorwen took the tray from her at the door so that the maid would not enter the parlor, and she thanked her with a smile that did not reach the parlor's air at all, and she shut the door, and she came back to her seat, and she poured for herself, and she said, "Go on." So Selvin went on. And as she went on, Yorwen began, behind the unmoving surface of her face, to count again. Not seconds this time. Other things. She counted how many of Selvin's complaints were against the Duke, and how many were against her own years. She counted the verbs Selvin used about him, and noticed they were all verbs of receiving, and none of giving. She counted, in particular, the number of times Selvin said the word promise, and the number of times she said the word kept, and found them in a ratio of 11 to none. When Selvin had finished, which she did not announce, but which became evident from the way her hands settled, Yorwen waited a full beat before she spoke, because she had learned long ago that the silence after a confession is the part of the confession in which the confessor decides whether she meant any of it. Selvin, in that silence, did not unsay a word. She only set the cup down, very carefully, on the saucer Yorwen had not provided, and folded her own hands in her lap, and waited. Yorwen said, "You will not get a settlement from him." Selvin's eyes lifted. They were dark, and the firelight made them darker, and there was in them not yet anger but the readiness for it. Yorwen went on, evenly, because the evenness was the gift she was choosing to give. He cannot afford it. I know this because I keep his books. I have kept them for 6 years. He believes a man named Pendry keeps them. Pendry is a clerk I hired with my own pin money to put his name on the cover of a ledger I write. The Duke does not read ledgers. He reads totals. The totals I give him are the totals I wish him to see. The estate is solvent, but only because I have made it so, and only by margins that would not survive a settlement of the size you require. If you press him, he will borrow against the South Farms. The South Farms cannot stand it. Within 2 years, he would have to sell the timber, and within 4 the dower house, and within 7 there would be no estate to be the Duke of. He would not survive that, as a man, by which I do not mean he would die. I mean he would become something I have spent my marriage preventing him from becoming, which is small. Selvin looked at her for a long time. She said, "At last, you speak of him as if he were a child you were raising." Eorwen considered this. She said, "I speak of him as the man I married, who is not a child, but who has been protected from the cost of himself for so long by so many people that he has lost the ability to imagine that there is a cost. I do not say this to excuse him. I say it as a fact about the household you are proposing to dismantle. If you dismantle it, you will not be paid out of its rubble. There will be no rubble worth taking. There will only be a man humiliated in his own county, and a woman, namely myself, who will then have nothing to defend, and therefore no reason at all to be courteous to you. I am being courteous now because I have something to lose. I want you to understand that the courtesy is information, not weakness." Selvin sat very still. "Then what," she said, "do you propose?" Eorwen did not answer at once. She rose and went to the small writing desk in the corner, and she opened a drawer, and she took from it a folded paper, and she came back and laid it on the low table between them. The paper had been prepared 3 weeks ago. It was in her own hand. It was witnessed at the bottom by her cousin. The one Selvin had not known was hers. It set out, in 7 short clauses, an arrangement, a stipend, modest but real, paid quarterly from a fund that was Eorwen's own and not the estate's. A small house, not on the coast but inland, near a town with a good doctor and a tolerable society, where Selvin might live as a widow of means without lying about it, because the deed would be in her own name. A single, plain condition, which was that all letters in her possession from the Duke be returned to Eorwen, sealed, and that no further correspondence be undertaken, and a final clause, which Selvin read twice, that none of these arrangements depended in any way upon the Duke's knowledge or consent. The Duke was not a party to the paper. The Duke would not be told. The paper had been made, and would be executed by Eorwen alone. Selvin set the paper down. "Why?" she said. Eorwen looked at the fire. "Because I do not wish to be the wife who fought you in a parlor," she said. "Because I do not wish you to be the woman who broke a house. Because the boy you did not tell him about deserved better than the silence he was given, and I cannot offer him anything now, but I can offer his mother a door out of the room she has been kept in. Because I have been kept in a room as well, although a larger one with better curtains, and I am tired of pretending the curtains make it not a room. Because the only person in this story whose pride needs a wound is not in this house tonight. And because I would like, when this is over, to walk out of my own parlor on my own feet." Selvin did not answer. She picked up the paper again. She read it a 3rd time. She read it slowly, the way one reads a contract whose author one has just begun, against expectation to respect. When she had finished, she folded it along its existing creases and set it back on the table, and she said, in a voice that had lost some of its traveling coat stiffness, "You have thought about this." Eorwen said, "I have thought about very little else for 91 days. Selvin said, "And if I do not sign?" Eorwen said, Then you will leave this house with what you came in with, which is a grievance and a wet cloak, and I will not stand in your way, and I will not pursue you, and I will not write to anyone about you. And you will find that the Duke, when he discovers what has passed in this room, will choose me, because I keep the books, and because he is a man who in the end chooses the person who keeps the books. I do not say this proudly. I say it as the second piece of information I owe you. Selvin sat with this for a while. The clock had moved to 9. The rain had eased at the windows. Somewhere far off a dog made one short bark and stopped, as if remembering it had nothing to bark at. Selvin signed at 23 minutes past 9. She used the pen Eorwen offered her, which was a steel-nibbed one with a slight bend at the tip that Eorwen had been meaning to replace, and had not, because the bend made her own hand neater. The ink dried in the time it took Selvin to draw breath. Eorwen blotted the signature herself, with a square of clean paper from the desk, and she did not seal the document yet, because the seals belonged to the strongbox upstairs, and she would not leave Selvin alone in the parlor with the fire while she fetched them. She folded the paper instead, and she put it inside her bodice against the place where her ribs met, because there was no pocket on her gown deep enough, and because she trusted her own person more than any drawer in the house. She rang the bell then for a second time, and when the maid came, she asked for a hot supper to be sent up to the small parlor for one guest, and a room prepared in the east wing for the night, with a fire in it, and dry slippers, and a brush for the cloak. The maid, who was 18 and observant, and had not been told anything, but had not needed to be told anything, curtsied and left. Selvin looked at her. "You are giving me a bed," she said. Eorwen said, "You have come a long way. You will sleep here, and you will leave in the morning before he is up, and you will not see him, and he will not see you, and the carriage I send with you will take you as far as Cavarel, where my cousin will meet you and accompany you to the house. The house is ready. I made it ready in the second week. I did not know whether you would come, but I had decided that if you came, I would be prepared. And if you did not come, I would write to you, and either way you would have it." Selvin shook her head once, slowly. "You bought a house," she said, "on the chance that I would arrive." Eorwen said, "I bought a house because there was a woman somewhere being kept like an animal in a stable." The house was the answer to a question I was going to ask, whether or not you ever rang my bell. The bell itself was incidental. They sat with that for a moment. Then Selvin, surprising them both, said, "May I ask you a question?" Eorwen inclined her head. Selvin said, "Did you ever love him?" Eorwen looked at the fire. She did not answer quickly. She did not answer slowly. Either. She answered at the speed of someone who has thought about the question often enough that the speed itself is no longer relevant. "I loved," she said, "the idea that he might become the man my father said he was. I loved, after that, the parts of him that were kind to the dogs and gentle with his sister. I loved, for a brief time, his laugh in a particular doorway in the spring of our second year. I have not," she said, "loved him for some while, and I do not say so with bitterness. I say it as one says the date." Then she looked back at Selvin, and she said, "And you?" Selvin did not look at the fire. She looked at her own hands. "I loved being chosen," she said. "I did not understand for a long time that being chosen and being loved are different verbs. I do now." They sat with that too. The supper came up. Eorwen did not stay for it. She rose, and she said she would have her own brought to her study, where she had work to finish, and she wished Selvin a quiet night. And she meant it. And Selvin, who had been ready 6 hours earlier to spit in this woman's face, said only, "Thank you," very quietly, and Eorwen pretended not to hear it. because gratitude in that room would have made the air heavier than either of them could yet carry. She closed the parlor door behind her. In the corridor, she stood for one breath. She put her hand flat against the wood, not for support, but for confirmation, because the wood had been there before her marriage and would be there after it, and that was the company she had chosen for the next few minutes. Then she walked, at her usual pace, neither hurried nor slow, to the study at the far end of the west wing. The study was hers. It had been called the Duke's study on the household plan, but in 6 years he had not crossed its threshold more than a dozen times, and on each of those occasions he had asked, almost shyly, whether she required anything from town. She sat at the desk. She opened the central drawer. She took out the ledger that bore the name Pendry on its cover. She turned to the page on which she had, 91 days ago, made a small mark in the corner, the size of a grain of rice. She entered, against today's date, in her neat impersonal hand, a single line, stipend account opened, Marith S. Quarterly, first payment, Michaelmas. She did not write the amount. The amount was on the paper folded against her ribs. She closed the ledger. She sat for a moment with her palms on its cover. The clock in the study struck the half-hour after 10. She thought about the Duke, 11 miles off, leaning over a table in a tavern with a man he believed he was cleverer than. She thought about the boy who had not lived past 3. She thought about the small house inland, with the apple tree she had asked about and been told there was, and the room on the south side that the agent had described as suitable for a sewing chair. She thought about her own bedroom upstairs, in which she had slept for 6 years across the corridor from a man who came in only on certain expected nights, and who for all those nights had been polite. She thought about how the politeness, in the end, was the thing she had most resented, because the politeness had been the cover under which everything else had been done. She did not weep. She had decided some weeks ago that she would not weep on this particular night, because tears, like settlements, are a resource, and she had use for hers later. She wrote, instead, the second letter of the evening, which was to her cousin, in Cavarel, confirming the arrival in the morning, and asking him to take particular care that no one at the post-house should see Selvin's face. She wrote a third letter, very short, to the agent who held the deed on the inland house, asking him to deliver the keys to Selvin personally, and to charge his fee to her own account. She wrote a fourth, even shorter, to the doctor in the inland town, recommending the new arrival as a woman of quiet habits and asking whether he would call upon her in her first week as a courtesy. She sealed each letter. She did not ring for them to be taken. She would take them herself in the morning to the post bag. She closed the desk. She rose. She blew out the candles, all but one, which she carried with her. She walked through the dim corridor past the parlor where Selvin, she knew, would by now have eaten a little of the supper and would be lying in front of the fire in the borrowed slippers, neither asleep nor weeping. She did not stop. She climbed the stairs. She passed the Duke's dressing room, where the bureau stood, and where, in the second drawer, under his cravats, a small box held a ring that had been bought in Aldermere on the 17th of April. She did not open the drawer. She would, in the morning, ask his valet, with whom she had a long understanding, to return the box to her. The box would not be in the bureau when the Duke next opened it. The drawer would be empty in that particular corner. He would notice. He would not, for some time, ask. When he asked, she would be ready. She entered her own room. She closed the door. She set the candle on the table by the bed. She undressed without help, because her maid had been told not to wait up, and she had told her maid that with the same level voice in which she told her everything, and her maid had asked no questions. She unlaced her stays. She took the folded paper from inside her bodice. She placed it under her pillow, not for safekeeping, but because she wanted, for one night, to sleep with it there. She blew out the candle. She lay back. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely. There was a moon somewhere, beyond the elms. The house was very quiet. She listened, as was her habit, for the sounds of it, the timber settling, the kitchen banking down, the distant cough of a horse in the stable, the wind, which had also eased. She heard, far off, the sound of hooves on the drive, returning. She counted them, 2 horses, walking. He had ridden out on the bay and taken his groom on the chestnut, which meant he was returning in his usual order, and was not therefore drunk, because he rode the bay home only when sober. He was a man of small, reliable patterns. She had learned them as another woman might learn a language. The hooves came up the drive. They stopped. There was the sound of the side door, which he used at night to avoid the main hall. There was the sound of his boots on the stone, then on the stair, then on the corridor outside her room. They paused, as they always paused, 3 steps before her door, because he had been taught as a boy that a gentleman does not enter without being invited and had never, in all their marriage, asked the next question. He stood there for a count of 4. She did not move. She was not asleep, but her breathing was the breathing of sleep, because she had practiced it as one practices a phrase in a foreign tongue. He went on. His door opened. His door closed. The house settled again. She lay in the dark, and she thought, with a clarity she had not expected, and did not refuse, that the destruction of a man's pride is not done by argument. It is done by removing, one by one, the things he believed were his, because he had never had to ask whether they were. The mistress he believed was his. The books he believed were his. The wife he believed was his. The narrative he believed was his. She had taken the first this evening. She had been taking the second for 6 years. She had taken the third, in some quiet part of herself, a long time ago. The fourth would take the rest of his life, and he would never quite see her doing it, because he had never learned to see her at all. She slept. She did not dream of him. In the morning the carriage left at 20 minutes past 5, before the kitchen was fully up, before the Duke had stirred, before the light had come over the elms. Selvin was in it, in a dry cloak that was not the bruised plum one, which Irwen had quietly sent to the laundry to be cleaned and forwarded. Selvin was not weeping. She had eaten a small breakfast in the parlor by herself, and she had not spoken to any servant who could later be asked what she looked like, and she had, before she left, set on the low table the bundle of 41 letters, tied with a piece of common string she had bought in a stationer's 3 years ago for a different purpose. Iorwen took the bundle. She did not open it. She walked with Selvin to the side door, the same door at which they had met 13 hours earlier, and she opened it on a courtyard where the cobbles were drying and a robin was making the small noise robins make when they have decided to be heard. Iorwen said, "You will write to my cousin if anything is required." Selvin said, "I will write to you, if I may, once a year, at Michaelmas. To say only that I am well." Iorwen considered. She said, "Yes, I would like that." Selvin nodded. She did not offer her hand, because she had understood, in the night, that Iorwen would not refuse it, and that the refusal would not be the point, and the offering would not be the point either, and that they had passed the place where hands were the right measure. She stepped into the carriage. The door closed. The driver, who was Iorwen's own, and who had been told nothing except that he was to drive carefully, clicked his tongue. The horses moved off. Iorwen stood in the courtyard until the carriage had crossed the second cattle grid, which was the place from which it could no longer be seen from the house. Then, she went back inside. She burned the letters in the kitchen range, one by one, not reading them. She watched each one curl. She counted them as they went. 41. The cook, who had been with the family for 22 years and whose discretion was the discretion of stone, set a cup of strong tea at Orwen's elbow without comment and went on with the bread. Orwen drank the tea. She went up to her room. She changed her gown for the gray one she wore on days she intended to be visible to her husband, because the gray one made her look, he had once said in a rare, unguarded moment, like a woman who could not be argued with, and she had decided, on hearing it, that she would be photographed in it on the day of her funeral. She went down to breakfast. The Duke was at the table. He was eating eggs. He looked up. He smiled the small habitual smile of a man whose evening had gone well in ways he could not mention, and he said, "Good morning, my dear. You are up early." She poured her own coffee. She said, "I have been up since 5. There was a matter at the side door." He raised his eyebrows in the polite way that meant he did not intend to ask further, because he assumed it was a tenant or a tradesman or some other thing that lived on the periphery of his attention. She did not elaborate. She buttered her toast. She let the silence hold. He did not fill it. She watched him eat. She thought, as one notices a cloud, that he was a handsome man, and that his pride was sitting on his shoulders this morning like a cat that did not know its house had been sold. He would learn over the course of the year that several drawers were emptier than they had been. He would learn over the course of the next year that the South farms were no longer his to borrow against, because she had quietly placed them in a trust that her father had set up for daughters of the line on the day of her birth, and that her father, who had also been a man who kept ledgers, had foreseen even this. He would learn over the course of the year after that no letter from a certain hand would come, and that the man at the tavern 11 miles off would no longer meet him, because that man had been quietly bought out by a third party who did not give his name, and that the third party was, in fact, her cousin. He would learn slowly. He would learn through absences. He would never have a single conversation in which to be wounded. He would have 1,000 small mornings in which to discover that the world had been arranged around him by a woman he had not bothered to know, and that the arrangement had now been altered, and that he had not been consulted because, in the end, he was not necessary to the arrangement at all. He would not divorce her. He would not dare. He would never raise his voice to her. He would never, in fact, raise his voice in her presence again, although neither of them would name the morning on which that habit ended, because neither of them would notice it. He would over time come to defer to her in small things, and then in larger ones. He would become a quieter man. He would become, in his 50s, a man people described as having grown into himself, by which they would mean that he had stopped expecting the world to be what he had been told it was. He would, much later, on a summer evening, with rain coming, say to her over a game of cards, "I do not believe I have ever truly understood you." And she would answer, without looking up from her hand, "No, my dear, you have not." And he would laugh once, shortly, and the laugh would have in it the first true respect of their marriage, and she would accept it as one accepts a coin offered late but in the right currency, and she would play her card, and she would win the trick, and the rain would begin, and the house would settle around them as it had settled for 6 generations, and that would, in its way, be the end of the story. But that is later. That morning, at breakfast, in the gray gown, she said only, "Will you ride today?" And he said, "I think not. The weather is uncertain." And she said, "As you like." And she finished her toast, and she rose, and she went to her study, and she opened the ledger, and she began the day's work. The postboy came at 9. The 4 letters of the evening went out with him. The robin in the courtyard continued, as it would continue all summer, with the small noise robins make when they have decided to be heard. In the inland town, by the end of the week, a woman in a brown cloak was seen walking under the apple tree in the garden of a small house newly opened, and the doctor called on her on the Thursday and reported afterward to his wife that she was a quiet sort, recently widowed, of good education, and that she had asked about the lending library and the church and the price of coal. The doctor's wife noted these things and forgot them, because the woman in the brown cloak did not invite further notice, which was, of course, the entire point. The 41 letters were ash. The ring in the small box was returned to Eorwen by the valet on the second morning, and placed by her in a drawer of her own desk that locked, because she had decided she would not destroy it. Not from sentiment, but from a clear-eyed sense that a piece of evidence is more useful than a piece of revenge. She did not need to use it. She knew she would not need to use it. The knowledge of its existence in her drawer was, by itself, a kind of weather inside the house, the kind that even a man who does not read weather can feel against his skin. The Duke felt it. He did not know what he felt. He felt it for the rest of his life. And so the secret she had carried for 91 days was put away, not undone. Not avenged in any way a stranger looking in from the gate would have called avenging, but rearranged, the way a woman who knows her rooms rearranges the furniture so that a man who comes home in the dark will find his shins meeting a chair that used to be elsewhere, and will, after a while, learn to walk more carefully through his own house, and will, after a longer while, learn to ask permission of the air before he sits down in it. She did not argue with the woman who came to her door. She did not raise her voice. She did not even ask the question most women in her position would have asked, which is why. She walked away from the argument before it began, because the argument was the thing he and the world expected, and she had decided, sometime in the second week, that she would not give either of them the satisfaction of being the woman they had cast. She walked away, and she took the script with her, and she rewrote it in a hand neither of them could read, and she handed back to him a life that looked, on its surface, exactly like the one he had left in the morning, with only the small detail that none of it any longer belonged to him in the way he had believed it did. That is how a pride is destroyed. Not in a room, not in a shout, in the long patient subtraction of the assumptions on which it was resting, until the man stands one morning in a corridor he has walked all his life and notices, with the smallest cold feeling at the back of his neck, that the corridor is not his and has not been for some time, and that the woman at the end of it who is pouring his coffee has been the floor under his feet all along, and that floors, when they choose to, can become doors. And now, you, sitting wherever you are sitting, with the lamp low and the night thinning around you, if you have ever been the one in the room who knew more than anyone in it suspected, and chose not to use what you knew the way the world told you to use it, if you have ever loved a house more than the person who believed he owned it, and protected the house by protecting yourself first, if you have ever been mistaken for soft and found, in the quiet of your own kitchen at 5 a.m, the steel you did not know you had been forging since girlhood, if you have ever opened a door on a woman you might have hated, and decided, in the 8 seconds between the bell and the latch, to be a different kind of woman than the story expected, then you already know the shape of what Eorwen did, because you have done some version of it yourself, in a smaller room with smaller stakes, and you have not always been thanked for it, and you have not always thanked yourself, and tonight I would like, if I may, to thank you. Tell me, when you have a moment, which line in this stayed with you longest, Whether it was the bell rung 3 times, or the chair that flattered in repose and disadvantaged in argument, or the 41 letters going one by one into the range, or the coin offered late but in the right currency. I should like to know, because the line that catches a listener tells the storyteller something about the listener that nothing else will. And if you would like to come back and sit by this fire again, the fire will be here. There is another story banked in the coals already, of a different house and a different woman and a different quiet undoing, and I will tell it when the night next thins like this one. Bring your tea. Bring whatever you are carrying. The chair opposite mine is, as it always is, kept for you. Sleep well and walk carefully through your own corridors, and remember that floors, when they choose to, can become doors. Good night.